Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi all and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. Today we'll be talking about the US-China trade war and its implications for India. I'm Tannmay, a research intern at the Takshashila Institution, and joining me today are Anupam, the professor of economics, and Anisree, a research associate at the institution. So let's dive right in. Firstly, let me set the scene for our audience. US President Donald Trump has continued his flip-flops on tariffs after initially announcing tariffs on countries on April 2nd. In a liberation day, as he called it himself, he quickly backtracked as stock markets tanked and reduced all the tariffs he had imposed to a blanket 10%. Two quick points on this. First, different countries were tariffed differently based on a formula his administration devised, based broadly on the import deficit the US had with these countries. This meant that India had a 26% tariff rate as compared to, say, 46% on Vietnam. Second, China has been an exclusion from Trump's tariff pause, and instead both China and the US have doubled down, with the tariffs between the two nations increasing. Currently, China's tariff on American products is 125%, and America's tariffs on Chinese products is currently up to 245%. Some products are at 145%, some are at 245%. Given this context, let's dive into our discussion. The first question is a little bit retrospective. What was India's scope to capture manufacturing when the US had different tariffs for different nations post-Liberation Day? As stated before, India had lower tariffs compared to other manufacturing nations like Vietnam. We had only 26% compared to Vietnam's 46%, and China was even higher, and is still higher. Could this and can this still be a competitive advantage for India?
Yeah, so let's again look at some of the data here, right? So the immediate challenge for India is the universal 10% tariff on all its exports to the US. And beyond this, the threat of the reinstatement of a higher country-specific tariff after the 90-day pause still looms large. So for India, it will be like 27%. It was 26 earlier, then it was adjusted to 27%. However, this 90-day pauses for all countries except China, where a trade war is already happening, is a period for negotiations on this thing. So coming back to the India question, whether India had any kind of competitive advantage if the tariffs were put, country-specific tariffs put. So India right now is at a slightly disadvantaged position when there is a universal 10% tariff. When the reciprocal tariffs were announced, India's competitors in sectors like textiles, electronics, and low-cost manufacturing, like you mentioned, Vietnam and Bangladesh, faced steeper tariffs than India. For instance, if you look at some of the competitors, like Bangladesh has like 37% tariff initially imposed on it. Pakistan almost similar to India, but 29%. And Vietnam at 46, Cambodia at 49, and Sri Lanka at 44. All those countries were like highly tariffed than India. So this means like at certain sectors, India's export would have been more cost competitive. So that was somewhere India would have gained a lot of advantage on this.
Yeah, but it's slightly more nuanced than that, right, Ani? So what it would have come down to is whether the end product would be cheaper to have gone from India after taking into account the tariff arbitrage.
Yeah.
So you have, let's say, India gets a 20% head start over Vietnam. And then the question is, would a product that comes from India be at least 20% cheaper or less than 20% more expensive than the product coming from Vietnam? If it is even, let's say, 19% less expensive, right, then it would make sense and India could gain. But even that is on the surface of it. Because what really we're talking about is that it's not just you have a direct kind of comparison between products going from India and products going from Vietnam. Probably India is not even manufacturing some of those products that is going from Vietnam. So even if there is a 20% tariff on, extra tariff on Vietnam than on India, is India even in the game? That's a big question, right? So for things that, let's say, India is manufacturing, so is Vietnam. We're trying to export. We're fighting against each other. We're competing in the global space. And now Vietnam has a 20% disadvantage than India. Then, okay, maybe India can gain. Even there, let's say, I don't know, some other country, maybe Philippines has 10% disadvantage, then suddenly it'll shift to Philippines and not to India necessarily. So then India must be at least 10% less expensive than Philippines for it to take advantage, right? So that's the way that the math would have worked.
So I think broadly, if I understand that correct, tariffs are a smaller part, but you also have to weigh the comparative advantage Vietnam might have in manufacturing these, and you have to see if that is less than 20%, right?
Second, exactly, right? And then you add to the fact that, okay, so if there's a product which, let's say, India is not even manufacturing, then we're talking about factories which are moving out of Vietnam into India, manufacturing it here, and then exporting it. Now that by itself will be probably more expensive than 20%. Maybe in the really long run, you could argue that, okay, it would be cheaper, but then we have to be sure that this tariff arbitrage will exist for the long run. And with Trump, there is no long run. There is absolutely no certainty. There's no way that businesses will take that decision. They'll just say, we'll wait and watch. We'll probably scale down the manufacturing in Vietnam, but not necessarily shift out of there in a hurry, because nobody knows what's going to happen, right? So would India have been in a position to take advantage of the tariff arbitrage? Maybe, but I think it would have been far too small and not significant enough. Now, two things would have mattered. That knowledge that tariff arbitrage would exist for a long time, then I think you could have gone all in and say, okay, we'll take advantage of it. And two, of course, India does. This is the most boring answer an economist can give, but India does all of those awkward structural reforms that we keep talking about, which would have made it competitive in global markets. So that's a big if. But yeah, that's the way to look at how things would have panned out. But anyway, now I think it's moot. We don't know what's going to happen after 90 days. But I mean, it's not moot in the sense that, let's say, nothing else changes. And I think we have to, when you're building contingency plans, you have to build contingency plans for every kind of scenario, right? So one of the scenarios is 90 days gets over, we go back to Liberation Day scenario, April 2nd scenario. And in that scenario, what would happen? And I think that's what we're trying to answer.
Right.
But I think we'll move the conversation forward. I'll stop talking very soon, but we'll move the conversation forward to the other scenario, which is what happens if we all get into different kind of deals. So
so on that actually, so currently as every country has a uniform 10% tariff, right? And the negotiation period is given as a chance for countries to, eliminate this 10% tariffs by entering into either a free trade agreement or similar agreements with the US. So given from what I understand, India is anyways, even with the 26% as compared to the 46%, that 20% difference may still not be enough for India to be competitive. But that is still in the shorter run. And the 10% blanket tariff that Trump seems to have an affinity towards, that was even there in Liberation Day for countries that the US did not have an import deficit with. That seems to be a longer term, tariff idea from Trump, that a 10% blanket tariff is something he wants to impose on countries that he cannot tariff higher, right? So from that point of view, from a long run perspective, so can India move manufacturing? And is that 10% enough for India to move manufacturing? If India does sign an FTA, if India eliminates that 10% tariff that is on that, is the possibility for tariff arbitrage still there, given the fact that maybe Liberation Day tariffs never come back? So this is the second scenario.
Yeah, I think there are two goals for India, right? If India wants to get into an FTA with the US. So one is that the 27% tariff that has to be removed, or have some kind of concession on that. And also the 10% universal tariff as well. So, and we have to consider that the 90 days pause it's just a respite from the Trump administration. That means India has to move fast and be one of the first movers when it comes to FTA or a bilateral treaty with the US. And here we have to understand a few things, right? US is one of the very few countries that India has a trade surplus with. Example for it, like in last financial year, India exported merchandise worth of 77.5 billion to the US, and we had 42 billion imports from the US as well. So resulting in on 35 billion trade surplus. So, which is a big deal for a country like India, which has mostly trade deficit with most of its trading countries. And we also have to see that US has already imposed 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum, and also a similar tariff on auto and auto components, and which are still in place. So that also some areas that we have to have some kind of understanding and negotiation to happen. And there are some estimates that sectors like engineering goods, which is one of the most exported items to US, has affected, we are expecting to lose almost like $5 billion this year itself because of these tariffs that are already in place. And the second most exported item to the US, gems and jewelries as well, which is also expected to hit really badly. So that means these tariffs are already in place and that are going to affect all these sectors. Hence, it means that India has to get a free trade deal with the US at the earliest. And that means India has to move really fast and have to have, only when it moves really fast, it would have a larger negotiating power compared to all these competitors that we were discussing earlier. And I feel Trump administration also mostly looking for some result to showcase that electorates that, okay, this is something that we are able to win out of this tariff situation.
Yeah, I would look at this entire situation from both a partial equilibrium and a general equilibrium analysis. So, from a partial equilibrium analysis, if you, again, there are multiple scenarios that you have to contend with. One, can an FTA with the US reduce it for zero? I think already Minister Piyush Goyal has said we are not going to do a zero for zero FTA, right? Yeah. So I don't think that is going to necessarily come about. Maybe we can reduce it to 5%, 6%. I don't know. You pick a number. This is speculation territory, which we shouldn't be getting into. But let's say India is able to reduce this thing. There's no reason to imagine that other countries will not be able to do the same as well. Of course, China is outside. I think they've completely decided and are determined to go on an all-out trade war with the US. But most other countries would also try and negotiate into some kind of trade deal with the US, perhaps. And that means that India will not be left with a big advantage, or the arbitrage advantage will go away, right? The second kind of scenario there is, as I said, in some kind of scenario, India is actually able to eke out a small difference between, in terms of what tariffs it will attract versus what tariffs other countries will attract. And that arbitrage, but that would be percentage points, maybe single digit percentage points, 3%, 4%, 5%. Is that again enough from the earlier conversation? Is that enough of an difference for India to truly take advantage of? I don't know. Not again without us having to do other things, right? So my answer always comes back to the same thing, which is you've got to get your domestic house in order first, right? And until you do that, all of this is going to be, it's superfluous at best. You might get a very short term kind of boost, but even that is negligible. I think overall, as Anisree was pointing out, India is poised to lose out something like $30 billion, right, in all of this. Even if we do cut a deal and so on, the damage that's already been done will withstand, will stand for some time. And I think we're set to lose for about $20-30 billion. Some of this is, again, it's forecasting, so you take it with a pinch of salt, but India is poised to lose some of that. The far more interesting analysis here is the general equilibrium analysis, right? What happens when all of this plays out? So if you have a massive trade war between US and the rest of the world in many ways, how does that actually play out, right? If that plays out in, let's say, a recession in the US, that immediately, irrespective of what arbitrage advantage you have, that will immediately mean that there's lesser demand for your goods, even if you have lower tariffs. And that would mean that India will lose out, right? So that, I think, is a far more useful analysis to make. The second bit is, what does it mean for the global economy? Will that lead to reduced trade flows across the board? Will that lead to far higher friction that is something that we have to look at, right? My kind of sense, and this is again big disclaimer right up front, which is that this is a completely speculative territory that we are in now. But my kind of sense is that there will be higher friction. There will be perhaps a recession or at least a slowdown in the US, because it's inevitable given that the flow of goods and services are going to be stopped. And that has potential to impact India. But at the same time, it could mean, and I'll come to this slightly later on if you please, but that could mean that it is imperative for India to cut out deals with other countries as well. We shouldn't be looking at US as the sole kind of place that we export to. I think this, even more than earlier, makes a case for stronger trade relations with the rest of the country, rest of the world, sorry, with the EU, with the UK, with Japan, with Australia, with other countries as well. I think that is imperative. And that's how you can perhaps negate some of the ill effects of the fallout with the US.
Right. You spoke a little bit about how even if India is able to negotiate any kind of trade deal, the difference between the tariffs that would be imposed on India and other countries would be in the single digits. So arbitrage is going to be difficult. But at least given what we see now and given Trump's broader vision, the one country with which India would have a bigger difference when it comes to tariffs with respect to the US is China. The trade war is already in full swing. Tariffs are bouncing higher day by day. First, a couple of questions on this, right? How long do you think this trade war is sustainable both for China and for the US? Secondly, again, we're coming back to this, but if it is sustainable in the long term, if both countries can somewhat run on this protectionist stance they're going on, is there, again, some scope for longer term Indian manufacturing growth, withstanding the fact that some legislative changes do come by? And thirdly, another third question on this is that does China's isolation in the trade world put across a more multilateral trading regime within Asia with India at the forefront?
Yeah. I think before I come to the opportunities for Indian manufacturing, if there is any, and before that, just put into perspective. So right now, China faces tariffs of up to 45% on import of all goods into the United States. And just before that, we had US levying almost 145% tax on Chinese imports, and China also slapped a 125% duty on American goods. But and the root cause of all this tariff war and everything, they have a lot of conversation going on the Chinese overcapacity. So I don't want to get into the details of it, just to put some numbers into perspective. As per one of the studies done by the CSIS, there was a number that for the EV sector alone from 2009 to 2023, the Chinese government provided a cumulative of USD 231 billion in subsidies, including US dollars 45 billion in 2023 alone, which is equivalent to 0.2% of the annual GDP of China in 2023. And here we also have to put it into perspective that right now, the trade war is happening between the world's two largest democracies, and not democracies, largest economies, and that gonna disrupt the global supply chains, slowing down the global economic growth eventually. So that's gonna have some kind of impact on all the economies across the world. And so there's a lot of happening, US is trying to block all the microchips entering China, and China is also trying to block certain critical minerals to the US. But again, that's how much China has a leverage on it is debatable. And now coming to the Indian aspect, so we have all this in perspective. And when we look at whether India will be able to replace China, I really don't think so. It won't be an easy move, at least. For example, in the sectors like pharmaceuticals, where especially in the general medicine, India might get some competitive edge. But again, if Trump decided to put tariffs on pharmaceuticals, which is under review at the moment, that will be eventually affect the sector as well. So you can't actually predict that, okay, these are the sectors that India might have an edge in competing with the China in this matter. But in a lot of other sectors, India might not be able to replace China until and unless it makes its export really competitive, right? That means like you have to get into an FTA with the US, not just with the US, but also with a lot of countries. And entirely it comes back to the conversation that we have to liberalize the entire economy. But also the problem is like I said, like there is a lot of subsidies that flowing into China's domestic production. That means like even if the US is blocked, there might be some ways like
Yeah.
China might find ways to dump it in the
So
foreign.
I think that's become a lot more harder now, given that so the US has tried to cut down on as many of those loopholes as possible, where China was able to kind of round trip the goods.
So that means like if India is dependent on China on certain products, some kind of inputs for any kind of manufacturing, then India will be also cut off from.
Yeah, I mean that is an entirely different conversation about the stupidity of trying to have this thing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
global value chains will rely on products from all over the
Yeah. Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
So I think that is not they'll not be able to solve that. I think they've already started talking about. They have exempted electronic products, etc.,
Yeah,
where the
yeah.
global value chain is strongest, and it will include components from China because, again, the domestic economy of the US is very interesting in that sense, right? Tim Cook gives $1 million to Donald Trump, and then voila, you get an exemption. So, but how long can the trade war last? I think so. As Ani was saying, this is a trade war between two of the most powerful economies.
Yes, that's what
Not
I meant.
democracy, but two economies.
That's what I meant for sure.
And the ability to sustain it really depends on your own domestic political economy, right? So China, for example, I think has much greater capacity to sustain such a trade war, which means they have much greater capacity to sustain damage to citizens, right? Because you look at even China's model of growth is built on this ability to kind of suppress one entire section of society, wage suppression, and that has led to this cheap manufacturing process, etc. So it's going to be slightly different when the businesses of your so-called liberated and much richer, wealthier elite on the coast gets affected. But nonetheless, I think China can pull it off slightly longer than the US can, because I think in the US we are now heading towards a situation where obviously all of this tariffs and trade war will result in greater inflation. And the Fed, for example, Jerome Powell already gave a statement saying, we don't know what kind of effect this will have on inflation. You could have runaway inflation in the US because of higher tariffs. And runaway inflation in the US is always, it's
a downstream thing.
Yeah, it's a complete no-go politically, right? So even if Trump is able to explain that, the tariffs are not really the cause for inflation, etc., I think it's going to be highly unpopular, right? That inflation can then result in, obviously, or will already result in downcast business sentiment. I think that will have definitely a big effect on investment climate. And so that can result in a slowdown, job creation, a slowdown in overall economic output, and therefore, at least a mild recession in the US. So I think all of these things will play out. So I don't think this is going to be a very long-term strategy, or should not be a very long-term strategy for the US. But again, all of this is based on a premise that you have rational policymakers that do not want to harm their own citizens. But that entire premise can be thrown out of the window, given that they started the trade war in the first place, given that clearly the trade war is going to be affecting your own citizens, right? So we don't know. The answer is just we don't know. We live in very strange times indeed, and so it's okay. You can expect anything.
Makes sense. A quick point on something. So, China's biggest export to the United States at $124 billion of value in 2023 is electronics and electrical equipment, right? Just a broader view on what impact this is going to have on US tech dominance. And I also want to maybe hear a little bit on the reverse, because when you hear of Chinese AI companies like DeepSeek and all, they still rely on American tech, right? So what is going to be tech's role in shaping how this trade war continues, given that at least in the US, the tech lobby has decent vested interests within the US government with Musk and the rest of the people? Just maybe a quick note on this before we move to...
See, the relationship between US and China on the tech front has been fractious for some time now. Given that US has stopped Chinese investment in the US to stop stealing tech IP and so on. US has also been very careful about what kind of investments go into China. China has been very careful about what kind of investments come into China. So I think all around the tech front has been guarded for quite some time. In terms of investment, in terms of this thing. But that is very different from trade as such, right? So electronic products, which is just export of finished products to the US from China, is very different from, investment. So investments have not really been looked at all.
Correct.
In all of this, right? In the trade war, it's really just goods, not even services. Services are carrying on as it was, but it's goods that have been stopped, right? So I think that is an entirely different question. I don't think that will matter, but as long as we're looking at intermediate goods coming from China into the US, I think the US tech sector will get affected by it, which is why they've already lobbied and created an exemption for it. I think what you'll end up having, and this is, I'm being only half serious and half joking, but I think very soon you'll have bureaucracy take over the US customs and entire kind of trading regime. Because what they're going to do is they'll put some form of this kind of blanket tariff on all products, all countries, with exceptional higher tariffs on certain countries in terms of, maybe China, and then some other countries will not play ball. So higher tariff for you, higher tariff for them, lower tariff for you, lower tariff for this, lower tariff for that, but higher tariff for this. And so what you're going to have is an extremely complicated set of tariffs, which is going to be highly subjected to the domestic political economy, to lobbying, which the US, as it is, has an extremely strong kind of lobbying power. So US corporates have high lobbying power. So what you're going to have is deep set bureaucracy. And the irony of all of this is that, you have a Doge and who's trying to cut down on bureaucracy. But the end result of all of this is going to be much greater bureaucracy, right? On one hand. And on the other hand, I think you're going to have, a new age Dawood Ibrahim sort of person in the US who's going to be smuggling, because that's what happens, right? Just historically speaking, by the way, the UK was one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And with the greatest amount of red tape, with the greatest amount of smuggling, all of it. And all of that went away when the UK made it easier to import. Right? They cleared up their customs duties, they lowered it, and then they cleared the rules and regulations surrounding imports. And voila, UK became one of the cleanest countries in terms of bureaucracy, right? But US is now going in the opposite direction. So, you can expect much greater red tape. You can expect an exemption list, which is far, far greater than the original tariff list. And you can expect some form of smuggling networks, this thing. So if any of you dear listeners are so inclined, I think there's a career there. Slightly risky, but I think a career nonetheless.
And given that you've spoken about corruption, I think broadly, it's established economic consensus that, free trade regimes are much better than protectionism, and that has been the evolution of economic philosophy throughout the last century. So
but no one told Trump.
Yeah, that's what I want to have as a concluding note, right? What do you think about this shift towards mercantilism and protectionism by both the major economies? China was already mercantile in some sense. Now the US shift towards this. This is again a little speculation, but
I don't think China was mercantile at all. I mean, they were very selectively, I don't think mercantile would be the right adjective. China's economy was in fact far more open than India's for imports and exports, right? They would just block investment into certain sectors, etc. But in terms of input, China is one of the biggest importers in the world. And it's one of the biggest exporters in the world, right? But US is now, it's going through the shift. But I think it's obviously extremely sad for global trade and just even global growth, because we've seen that the greatest periods of economic growth is always correlated with the greatest periods of trade growth, right? This is true of the 80s, 90s, 2000s periods where, these two things happened. But even just after the World War II and before Cold War started, after the First World War and so on, there are periods where you have had great growth in trade, and that is correlated with great economic benefits to nearly, every other country that's participated in trade, right? So now I think this is bad news for developing economies that were hoping to kind of grow via export. So, this is bad news for large parts of Africa. This is bad news for developing countries in Asia. This is bad news for, any other country that's hoping to kind of develop through export, right? Because when your global trade gets hit, I think it's bad. You will have, of course, countries which will form, bigger countries will form trading blocks, etc. But what happens to, I don't know, the Botswanas of the world? I think that's where countries will get hit. Even Bangladesh, for example, their best hope is to get into regional trading bloc with India on one hand and China on the other. If not, I think they'll lose out. So, fractured trade is not good for pretty much any country in the world. Even there, I would argue that you don't necessarily need to get sucked into this global trade war. If you have your wits about you, you're better off. You can do whatever else for signaling purposes, but I think you're better off trying to overall lower your trade barriers. Get into as many trade agreements as possible. Get into the US, get one with the UK, get one with Europe, get one with anyone who's willing to, get into trading. Maybe not China, but that's
basically everyone else. Yeah.
Maybe everyone else, right? Get into a trading relationship. I think that's good for you. So,
Anisree, any concluding remarks?
No, I think exactly what he said. So I feel like if India wants to have a faster economic growth, the best solution for it is to liberalize it. Yeah.
Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in, and hope you join us in the next episode.
Cheers.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.